Act 3 marks a crucial stage in Eliza's transformation. For the first time, she is tested in an upper-class social environment. The act shifts the focus from pronunciation training to the more difficult challenge of social behavior and conversation. The setting is Mrs. Higgins' drawing room. Unlike Higgins' practical and scientific apartment, Mrs. Higgins' home is elegant, refined, and artistically designed. The room reflects wealth, culture, and sophistication. The decor includes Morris wallpaper, tasteful artistic decorations, and an open, uncluttered arrangement. Every detail suggests refinement and good taste. This setting is important because it reflects Mrs. Higgins' personality. She is educated, modern-minded, intelligent, and cultured. Unlike her son, she understands both intellectual ideas and social relationships. The atmosphere of the room also provides the perfect setting for Eliza's first social test. The act begins when Professor Higgins arrives unexpectedly at his mother's house. As usual, Higgins behaves rather rudely and impulsively. He enters without much consideration for social etiquette and immediately begins discussing his plans. Mrs. Higgins is not surprised by his behavior. She knows her son's personality very well and worries that he may embarrass or insult her guests. This moment reveals one of Higgins' major weaknesses. Although he is highly educated and intellectually brilliant, he lacks social manners and emotional sensitivity. He often says whatever comes into his mind without considering how others may feel. Shaw uses this contrast to challenge conventional ideas about refinement. Higgins speaks perfect English and belongs to the upper class, yet he often behaves less politely than many ordinary people. During the conversation, Higgins explains his experiment to his mother. He proudly describes how he has been training Eliza and improving her pronunciation. He is excited by her progress and wants Mrs. Higgins to observe the results for herself. However, Mrs. Higgins immediately recognizes a potential problem. While Eliza has learned to speak properly, she has not yet mastered the art of upper-class conversation. She may know how to pronounce words correctly, but she does not fully understand the topics, manners, and social conventions expected in polite society. This distinction is extremely important. Shaw suggests that social acceptance requires more than correct pronunciation. It also involves cultural knowledge, behavior, confidence, and understanding of social expectations. Thus, before Eliza even arrives, the audience becomes aware of a possible danger. Her speech may have improved dramatically, but her ability to function naturally in upper-class society remains uncertain. This tension creates anticipation for the famous Tea Party scene that follows, where Eliza's progress, and the limitations of Higgins' experiment, will be tested for the first time in front of respectable society. Therefore, the opening of Act 3 establishes a refined social setting, highlights Higgins' weaknesses, demonstrates Mrs. Higgins' wisdom, and prepares the audience for one of the most important social experiments in the entire play. The central event of Act 3 is Eliza's first appearance in upper-class society. This scene serves as the first major test of Higgins' experiment and provides some of the most memorable comedy in the entire play. The guests gradually arrive at Mrs. Higgins' drawing room. Those present include Mrs. Ainsford Hill, Clara Ainsford Hill, Freddie Ainsford Hill, Colonel Pickering, and later Eliza Doolittle. The gathering creates a perfect social testing ground. For the first time, Eliza must interact naturally with respectable upper-class people outside Higgins' home. Everyone is eager to see whether the transformation has been successful. When Eliza enters the room, she immediately creates a powerful impression. She is elegantly dressed, well-groomed, and carries herself with confidence. Most importantly, she speaks with remarkable accuracy and refinement. Her pronunciation is so polished that no one would guess she was once a poor flower seller from the streets of London. At first glance, the experiment appears to be a complete success. Mrs. Higgins is greatly impressed and famously describes Eliza as a triumph of Higgins' teaching and the dressmaker's skill. This comment is significant because it acknowledges both aspects of the transformation. Higgins has improved Eliza's speech, while her appearance has also been carefully reconstructed to suit upper-class expectations. However, the real challenge soon becomes apparent. Although Eliza has mastered pronunciation, she has not yet mastered upper-class conversation. As the discussion continues, Eliza begins talking about subjects that respectable society considers inappropriate for polite conversation. She casually mentions drunkenness, gin drinking, family disputes, a possible murder, and even a stolen hat. The humor of the scene comes from the contrast between how she speaks and what she speaks about. Her language sounds perfectly refined and elegant. However, the content of her conversation remains rooted in her working-class experiences and background. The guests are shocked, confused, and fascinated at the same time. This scene reveals an important truth about the experiment. Higgins has successfully changed Eliza's accent, but he has not completely transformed her social knowledge or cultural habits. Speech can be taught relatively quickly, but social behavior and experience require much more time. At this point, Higgins cleverly intervenes to save the situation. Realizing that Eliza's conversation is becoming embarrassing, he casually claims that her unusual way of speaking represents a fashionable new form of conversation known as new small talk. Because Higgins is regarded as an expert and a gentleman, the guests immediately accept his explanation. Instead of questioning Eliza, they assume that her strange remarks are simply part of a new social trend. This moment contains one of Shaw's sharpest social criticisms. The scene exposes the superficiality of upper-class society. The guests are so impressed by Eliza's accent, appearance, and confidence that they ignore the actual meaning of her words. They judge her entirely by external signs of refinement rather than by the content of her speech. From a competitive examination perspective, this scene demonstrates Shaw's argument that society often values appearance more than substance. People are willing to accept almost anything as long as it is presented in the correct accent and style. Therefore, Eliza's first social test is both a partial success and a partial failure. She proves that language can dramatically alter social perception, but she also reveals that true social integration involves much more than pronunciation alone. The scene combines comedy, satire, and social criticism while advancing the central themes of language, class, and identity. As the Tea Party scene continues, several important developments occur that reveal both the strengths and limitations of Higgins' experiment. One significant outcome is Freddie Ainsford Hill's growing attraction to Eliza. Unlike the others, Freddie is completely fascinated by her. He is attracted not only to her beauty but also to her uniqueness and freshness. Eliza does not behave like the conventional young women of upper-class society. Her unusual combination of elegance and spontaneity makes her far more interesting than the people Freddie normally meets. This attraction becomes important later in the play when Freddie develops genuine affection for her. Another famous moment occurs when Eliza uses the expression, "not bloody likely." Today this phrase may seem mild, but during Shaw's time the word, bloody, was considered extremely vulgar and shocking in polite society. When Eliza says these words, the audience immediately notices the contrast. She speaks with perfect pronunciation, yet suddenly uses a socially unacceptable expression. The incident created controversy when the play was first performed because audiences were surprised to hear such language on stage. The significance of this moment is profound. Even after hearing this supposedly vulgar expression, many people continue to admire Eliza because of her refined accent and appearance. Shaw uses this scene to mock social pretensions and expose the superficial standards of upper-class society. He suggests that people often pay more attention to how something is said than to what is actually being said. After the guests leave, the tone of the play becomes more serious. Mrs. Higgins begins to criticize the experiment. Although she acknowledges Eliza's progress, she points out an important limitation. Eliza is not yet fully presentable in society because her conversation still reveals aspects of her original background. Mrs. Higgins understands that language alone cannot completely transform a person. Social habits, experiences, and emotional development are equally important. Her criticism soon becomes even deeper. She observes that Higgins and Pickering have been treating Eliza more like an object than a person. From her perspective, they treat Eliza like a doll, a project, or a scientific experiment rather than a human being with emotions, ambitions, and a future. This leads Mrs. Higgins to ask one of the most important questions in the entire play: what will happen to Eliza after the experiment is over? Neither Higgins nor Pickering has a satisfactory answer. This question introduces the central problem of the later acts. Eliza is now caught between two worlds. On one hand, she cannot easily return to her former life as a flower seller. Her education and experiences have changed her forever. On the other hand, she is not fully accepted as a member of the aristocracy. Despite her progress, society may never completely forget her origins. As a result, Eliza begins to face an identity crisis. She no longer belongs entirely to her old world, but she does not fully belong to the new one either. This becomes one of the most important themes of Pygmalion. Transformation can create opportunities, but it can also create uncertainty about one's place in society. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this scene is that Higgins and Pickering fail to recognize the problem. They focus almost entirely on the success of the experiment. They are proud of Eliza's achievements and excited by their own accomplishment. However, they ignore the emotional consequences for Eliza herself. Mrs. Higgins becomes increasingly frustrated by their lack of understanding and finally exclaims, "Oh, men. Men, men." This famous line reflects Shaw's criticism of male insensitivity. Mrs. Higgins believes that the men are so absorbed in intellectual success that they fail to consider human feelings and responsibilities. Through this scene, Shaw introduces important feminist concerns and demonstrates the difference between intellectual achievement and emotional understanding. Therefore, the final section of Act 3 moves beyond comedy and begins to explore serious questions about identity, responsibility, gender, and human dignity. It prepares the audience for the emotional conflicts that will dominate the remaining acts of the play. Although the famous embassy reception is not shown directly on stage in Pygmalion, it is one of the most important events in the play and represents the final social test of Higgins' experiment. At this prestigious London gathering, Eliza is presented among aristocrats, diplomats, and members of high society. The purpose of the event is to determine whether she can successfully pass as a lady of noble birth. During the reception, a fascinating character named Zoltán Kárpáthy, also known as Nepomuk, plays an important role. Kárpáthy is a Hungarian interpreter and a former student of Higgins. Because of his expertise in languages and accents, he carefully studies Eliza's speech. Ironically, instead of discovering that she was once a flower girl, he reaches the opposite conclusion. Kárpáthy believes Eliza's speech is too perfect to belong to an ordinary Englishwoman. Her pronunciation is so flawless that he concludes she must be a foreign aristocrat, possibly a Hungarian princess. This moment represents the ultimate success of Higgins' training. The irony is that Eliza succeeds so completely that experts cannot believe she is English at all. Rather than exposing her, Kárpáthy unintentionally confirms the success of the experiment. As a result, Higgins wins his famous bet. Eliza successfully passes in high society, proving that language can help a person cross social barriers. However, Shaw immediately encourages us to look beyond this apparent victory. The act also focuses on the importance of Mrs. Higgins as a character. Mrs. Higgins represents qualities that are largely absent in her son. She possesses wisdom, refinement, emotional intelligence, and practical judgment. Throughout the play, she understands people better than Higgins does. A useful comparison can be made between the two characters. Mrs. Higgins is socially aware, while Higgins is socially awkward. Mrs. Higgins is emotionally sensitive, while Higgins is often insensitive. Mrs. Higgins is practical and realistic, while Higgins is primarily intellectual and theoretical. Through this contrast, Shaw suggests that true wisdom requires emotional understanding as well as intelligence. Another important theme highlighted in this section is appearance versus reality. On the surface, Eliza now looks and sounds exactly like a lady. Her clothing, manners, and speech create the appearance of aristocratic refinement. However, Shaw reminds us that external appearance does not automatically change a person's inner experiences, memories, or identity. This leads to one of Shaw's major social criticisms. Society judges people primarily by three things: their clothing, their accent, and their appearance. Very few people take the time to understand character, values, or personal history. The success of Eliza's transformation exposes how superficial these social judgments can be. If a flower girl can be accepted as a princess simply by changing her speech and appearance, then the distinctions between social classes may not be as natural or meaningful as society claims. Therefore, the final significance of Act 3 is not merely that Eliza passes a social test. The deeper lesson is that language possesses enormous social power, while society often mistakes appearance for reality. Through Eliza's success, Shaw challenges traditional ideas about class, identity, and human worth, preparing the audience for the emotional and psychological conflicts that will emerge in the next act. In short, Act 3 proves the success of Higgins' experiment, highlights the wisdom of Mrs. Higgins, and strengthens Shaw's critique of a society that judges people by accent, clothing, and appearance rather than by the true character. This slide focuses on some of the most important analytical ideas in Act 3. Shaw moves beyond the simple story of Eliza's transformation and uses the events of the Tea Party scene to criticize society and explore deeper social issues. Let us begin with the comparison between Clara Ainsford Hill and Eliza. Clara is born into the upper class and possesses refinement naturally because of her upbringing. Eliza, by contrast, is born poor and must acquire refinement through training and hard work. However, there is an interesting irony here. Clara belongs to a respectable family, but the Ainsford Hills are experiencing financial decline. They maintain the appearance of social status despite economic difficulties. Eliza faces the opposite situation. She has a poor background but learns to present herself as a lady. Thus, both women are hiding something. Clara hides financial weakness, while Eliza hides her working-class origins. Through this contrast, Shaw suggests that social identity is often based on appearances rather than reality. Another important aspect of Act 3 is social satire. Throughout the Tea Party scene, Shaw mocks upper-class society. He exposes its artificial behavior, shallow judgments, an obsession with accents, manners, and appearances. The guests admire Eliza not because they understand her character, but because they are impressed by her pronunciation and appearance. This demonstrates how easily society can be deceived by external signs of refinement. Shaw's message is clear. Many social distinctions are artificial and superficial. Act 3 also develops several new relationships. The relationship between Mrs. Higgins and Eliza becomes increasingly important. Mrs. Higgins sympathizes with Eliza and understands the emotional challenges she faces. Unlike Higgins, she sees Eliza as a human being rather than an experiment. Her concern, protection, and motherly guidance make her one of Eliza's strongest supporters. The relationship between Freddie and Eliza also begins to develop. Freddie's admiration goes beyond social curiosity. He is genuinely attracted to Eliza and appreciates her individuality. Later in the play, Freddie will become an important source of emotional support, especially when Eliza feels misunderstood by Higgins. One of the central ideas of the act is language as power. Shaw demonstrates that perfect speech can create an entirely new identity. Because Eliza speaks like an aristocrat, society assumes that she belongs to the aristocracy. Language gives her social mobility and access to opportunities that were previously impossible. However, Shaw also suggests that this mobility may be partly an illusion because social acceptance based solely on speech remains fragile. The act also reveals important aspects of Higgins' character. Higgins is undoubtedly brilliant. His success proves his extraordinary talent and knowledge. Yet he remains proud, emotionally careless, and often insensitive to the feelings of others. The embassy success reveals an interesting contradiction. Higgins openly criticizes the superficial values of high society, yet he successfully manipulates and fools that same society. This demonstrates both his intelligence and his arrogance. Finally, Act 3 develops several major themes. The The theme of appearance versus reality becomes increasingly important as Eliza's external transformation hides her true background. The theme of language and class remains central because speech continues to determine social acceptance. The theme of identity crisis emerges as Eliza begins to lose her connection to her old world without fully belonging to the new one. The theme of gender roles appears through Mrs. Higgins' criticism of male insensitivity. The theme of social hypocrisy is exposed through the behavior of the upper classes. The theme of transformation advances as Eliza successfully enters high society. Finally, the theme of emotional neglect emerges because Higgins focuses on success while ignoring Eliza's emotional needs. Therefore, Act 3 represents a turning point in the play. The experiment appears successful on the surface, but deeper problems begin to emerge. Shaw uses satire, irony, and social criticism to show that language may change a person's social position, but it cannot automatically solve questions of identity, belonging, and human dignity. Before moving to Act 4, let us review the important symbols and key points from Act 3. One important symbol is Mrs. Higgins' drawing room. The drawing room represents civilization, refinement, balance, and social harmony. Unlike Higgins' scientific apartment, this room combines culture with human understanding. It reflects Mrs. Higgins' wisdom, emotional intelligence, and practical judgment. Symbolically, it represents the ideal balance between intellect and humanity. Another significant symbol is Eliza's dress. Her elegant clothing symbolizes artificial transformation. The dress allows society to perceive her as a lady, even though her background remains unchanged. Through this symbol, Shaw demonstrates how easily appearance can influence social judgment. The word, bloody, is also symbolic. When Eliza uses the expression, not bloody likely, the audience sees a clash between appearance and identity. Although she looks and sounds like a refined lady, traces of her original background still emerge. The word symbolizes the tension between external transformation and inner reality. The embassy party serves as the ultimate social test. It represents the final examination of Higgins' experiment. Eliza's success at the reception proves that language and appearance can overcome social barriers. At the same time, the event exposes the superficial nature of a society that judges people primarily by accent and manners. Now let us summarize the key revision points. Eliza appears elegant, sophisticated, and highly refined. However, her conversation still reveals elements of her working-class background. Freddie becomes attracted to Eliza and begins developing genuine admiration for her. Mrs. Higgins continues to worry about Eliza's future and the consequences of the experiment. Higgins remains focused on the intellectual success of his project rather than its emotional effects. The embassy test ultimately proves the success of the experiment, as Eliza successfully passes among members of high society. Most importantly, Shaw uses these events to criticize superficial class distinctions and demonstrate how society often values appearance, accent, and manners more than character and humanity. Thus, Act 3 marks the triumph of the experiment on the social level, while simultaneously introducing deeper questions about identity, belonging, responsibility, and human dignity that will dominate the remaining acts of the play.